My name is Scarlett Hayes. I am 27 years old, a veterinary technician who has spent 6 years learning to read pain in creatures who can't tell you where it hurts. And until the night a security guard called me into a back office to watch grainy footage on a laptop screen, I believed my boyfriend joining a gym was the sweetest thing he had ever done for me. Derek Wallace and I had been together almost 4 years. He worked as a mechanic at Coleman's Auto on the edge of town, the kind of guy who came home every night with grease under his fingernails and grease stains on his jeans that never quite came out in the wash. He wasn't the type to fuss over his appearance. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, let his hair grow shaggy until I finally dragged him to a barber myself, and used to laugh whenever I mentioned things like skincare or protein shakes, calling it all nonsense for people with too much free time. I loved him anyway. I loved the version of him that didn't perform for anyone, the guy who fell asleep on the couch with motor oil still on his hands, who could fix anything with a wrench and absolutely nothing with words. We weren't glamorous. We split rent on a small 2-bedroom apartment near the animal hospital where I worked, ate takeout more nights than either of us wanted to admit, and built a comfortable, unremarkable life that felt, at the time, like exactly enough. We met 4 years earlier at a barbecue thrown by a mutual friend, back when I was still finishing up my certification, and Derek was 2 years into his job at Coleman's. He showed up late, still smelling faintly of the shop, apologized for it without any real embarrassment, and made me laugh within the first 10 minutes by telling a completely unfiltered story about a customer who tried to argue that his car ran on vibes instead of oil changes. There was nothing polished about him, and that was exactly what I liked. I had dated a string of men before him who cared more about how they looked in photos than how they actually treated me. And Derek's total disinterest in appearances felt, back then, like proof of something deeper underneath. His mother, Linda, adored me from the very first family dinner, told him more than once in front of me that I was better than he deserved, said it with a laugh, but meant every word of it. His friends liked me too, said I balanced him out, kept him from disappearing entirely into the version of himself that would rather spend a Saturday under a car than doing much of anything else. For a long time, that balance felt like the whole point of us. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early March, Derek came home from work and announced, almost sheepishly, that he had signed up for a membership at Ironclad Fitness, the newer gym that had opened up on the north side of town with a wall of windows and the neon sign that lit up half the parking lot at night. I remember exactly how he said it. "I want to do this for you, Scar. For us. I want to be better." I felt something warm bloom in my chest that night, the particular tenderness you feel when someone you love decides, all on their own, to try to become more of themselves. I told him I was proud of him. I meant it completely. For the first few weeks, everything about it seemed exactly as sweet as it sounded. Derek went 3, then 4 nights a week, dragging himself home sore and exhausted, complaining about his shoulders in a way that made me laugh because it was so unlike him to complain about physical discomfort at all, given how much of his job already involved crawling under cars and hauling engine parts. He started cutting back on the fast food he used to grab on his lunch break, started drinking protein shakes that smelled faintly of chalk and vanilla, started actually looking forward to Saturday mornings instead of sleeping until noon. I watched him change over those first 2 months with a kind of quiet awe. His shoulders filled out, his stomach flattened. He started standing differently, taller somehow, like the extra confidence had rearranged something in his posture before it ever showed up anywhere else. Friends who hadn't seen him in a while started commenting on it at cookouts and birthday parties, telling him he looked good, telling me I must be a good influence. I never once questioned why he was doing it. Why would I? He told me it was for us, and I had spent 4 years learning to trust every word that came out of his mouth without needing to check it twice. Around the same time, Derek started asking me questions he'd never bothered with before, what I thought about certain haircuts, whether I liked beards or clean-shaven better, whether certain colors suited him. I found it sweet at the time, assumed it was simply a byproduct of newfound confidence, a man finally paying attention to details he used to dismiss entirely. He bought a new cologne, something sharper and more expensive than the drugstore brand he'd worn our entire relationship. He started folding his shirts instead of leaving them in a heap on the dresser. Small things, individually meaningless, but together forming the outline of a man actively trying to become someone different, someone he apparently believed was more worth looking at. It was somewhere around the 3rd month that the small things started happening, the kind of small things that don't mean anything individually, the kind you only notice once you've already started looking backward instead of forward. He started going later in the evenings, sometimes not getting home until well past 9, telling me the gym got less crowded after 8, and he liked having more room on the equipment. He started keeping his phone face down on the nightstand, a habit I had genuinely never seen him have before, since Derek had always been the type to leave his phone lying around unlocked, without a second thought. He started taking longer showers when he got home, which I chalked up simply to sweat, though something about the timing of it, the way he always seemed to want to shower before he'd even say much of anything to me about his night, sat strangely in the back of my mind without fully forming into a real thought. I also started noticing the receipts. Derek had never been someone who tracked his spending closely, and I usually handled our shared budget since I was better with numbers, which meant I saw every transaction that came through our joint checking account, the one we used for rent and groceries and the occasional splurge. Supplement purchases started showing up more frequently than seemed necessary for one person. Protein powders, pre-workout mixes, things that cost more than I expected a beginner would need. A new pair of athletic shoes. A membership upgrade to something called the Elite Tier, which according to the gym's website included access to a private lounge area and extended hours. None of it, on its own, felt like evidence of anything. I told myself he was simply investing in something he cared about, the way I invested in continuing education courses for my job, the way people spend money on the things that matter to them. I told myself this over and over through the 4th month, even as the late nights kept stretching later, even as the showers kept getting longer, even as a version of Derek I barely recognized started emerging from beneath the one I had fallen in love with. The first real crack came from an unexpected place. My co-worker at the animal hospital, a receptionist named Priya, mentioned offhandedly during a slow afternoon that her cousin worked the front desk at Ironclad and had some pretty entertaining stories about the regulars. I laughed along without thinking much of it, until Priya said something that made my stomach drop before I even understood why. She said her cousin called one particular guy the flirt of the free weight section, said he came in almost every night, always chatting up whoever was working the machines near him, always somehow ending up spotting the same handful of women on bench press, even though he apparently barely knew how to spot anyone when he first joined. I asked, as casually as I could manage, what this guy looked like. Priya shrugged, said she didn't know exactly, just that her cousin thought it was funny. Some guy who showed up out of nowhere a few months back, looking like he barely knew what a gym was, and now walked around like he owned the place. I told myself it couldn't be Derek. There had to be a dozen men who fit that description at a gym with hundreds of members. I told myself that all the way home, all through dinner, all through the evening, Derek spent, once again, out past 9 o'clock. But the description kept circling back in my mind like something I couldn't quite shake loose. And 2 days later, I did something I had never done in 4 years together. I drove to Ironclad Fitness myself, parked across the lot where I could see through the wall of windows without being seen, and I watched. I saw him within 4 minutes, Derek laughing with a blonde woman near the squat rack, standing closer to her than any spotting position required, his hand resting on her lower back in a way that had nothing to do with proper form. I watched him do the same thing 20 minutes later, with a different woman entirely, a brunette near the water fountain, leaning in to say something that made her laugh and swat playfully at his arm. I sat there long enough to watch a pattern emerge, not just isolated moments, but something closer to a rhythm, the way he moved through the gym floor like he was working a room instead of working out. He'd spend a few minutes at one machine, glance around, drift toward wherever a woman happened to be standing alone, strike up conversation with an ease that startled me, given how awkward he'd always been in social settings with me during our early dating years. He never once looked in the direction of the free weights section for longer than it took to flex for whoever was watching. I sat in my car for almost an hour, watching a man I thought I knew move through that gym like it was his own personal audition. And I felt something in my chest go cold and very, very still. I didn't confront him that night. I drove home before he did, made dinner like nothing had happened, and let him tell me, once again, about how good his workout had been, how tired his legs were, how proud he was of hitting a new personal record on his squat. I nodded along and asked follow-up questions and felt, for the first time in our relationship, like I was watching a performance instead of listening to my boyfriend. I needed to understand exactly what I was looking at before I let myself react to it. Because a man flirting at the gym, as painful as it was to witness, wasn't necessarily proof of anything beyond bad judgment. I needed more than a parking lot stakeout and a receptionist's gossip before I let this become the thing that ended 4 years of my life. So I started paying attention the way I had learned to pay attention to sick animals who couldn't tell me what was wrong, watching for the small, specific symptoms hiding underneath the obvious ones. I began checking his phone when he was in the shower, something I had genuinely never done before, feeling sick with guilt every single time, even as I told myself I had every right to know what I was actually dealing with. His messages were mostly locked behind a passcode he'd changed sometime in the last few weeks. Another detail that landed heavier than it should have, since he'd used the same 4 digits, our anniversary, for the entire time we'd been together. I couldn't get into his phone, but I could still see notification previews flashing across the lock screen when it lit up on the counter, quick glimpses of names I didn't recognize, women's names, followed by messages that cut off before revealing anything definitive, though the tone of what I could read felt far too familiar for casual gym small talk. I started asking small questions at dinner, testing him without ever raising my voice, asking about his workout partners, asking who he usually trained with. He gave vague, easy answers, mentioned a guy named Trent he sometimes lifted with, never mentioned a single woman's name despite the fact that I had personally watched him flirting with at least 2 different ones in a single evening. The lying, more than anything else, was what finally hardened something inside me. I could have understood confusion. I could have understood a man genuinely trying to improve himself who occasionally got caught up in attention he wasn't used to receiving. What I couldn't make peace with was the deliberate, practiced way he edited his own life before handing it to me, leaving out entire people like they simply didn't exist. I decided I needed proof, solid enough that he couldn't talk his way around it, the same way I would never diagnose a case based on assumption alone when I could run the actual tests first. The following week, I went back to Ironclad Fitness during my lunch break, this time walking inside instead of watching from the parking lot. I told the front desk I was interested in a membership, let a friendly staff member walk me through a tour of the facility, and used the opportunity to quietly study the layout, the hours, the different sections where Derek supposedly spent his evenings. Near the end of the tour, I struck up conversation with the man showing me around, a broad-shouldered guy in his 30s named Trevor, who worked security during the evening shifts in addition to helping with tours during the day. I mentioned, carefully, that my boyfriend was actually already a member, described Derek loosely without naming him at first, mentioned he usually came in around 8 or 9 at night. Something shifted in Trevor's expression, a flicker of recognition he tried to smooth over with professional politeness. He asked a little too casually what my boyfriend's name was. I told him, Derek Wallace. Trevor's jaw tightened. He glanced around the gym floor for a moment before lowering his voice, telling me that if I had a few minutes, there was something he thought I should probably know, something he'd honestly been debating whether to say something about for weeks, uncertain if it was his place. He led me to a small office near the back of the building, away from the gym floor, and told me he'd been the one running the evening security shift for almost a year, responsible for locking up the building after closing and monitoring the security cameras positioned throughout the facility. including in the hallways near the private saunas and the staff-only recovery rooms that members weren't technically supposed to access without a trainer present. Trevor told me Derek had figured out, within his first month of membership, how to slip into those restricted areas after the main gym closed at 10, using a keycard glitch that let members linger in the building past posted hours if they timed it right with the cleaning crew's schedule. He told me this wasn't a one-time thing. He told me the cameras had picked up the same pattern, repeating itself at least once or twice a week for the last 2 months. Always different women. Always the same quiet practice routine of Derek staying behind after his workout while the gym floor emptied out. I felt my whole body go numb standing in that small office, the smell of rubber flooring and industrial cleaner suddenly overwhelming. Trevor hesitated, then told me he had copies of the footage saved, mostly because he'd been documenting it in case it ever became a liability issue for the gym itself. Unauthorized access to restricted areas being exactly the kind of thing that could get the facility in legal trouble if something ever went wrong. He asked if I wanted to see it. I told him yes, because I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I let myself feel any single emotion about it. He pulled up a folder on an old desktop computer in the corner of the office. The footage was grainy, black and white, time-stamped across the bottom corner of the screen. I watched Derek, unmistakably Derek, slip past a prop door into the recovery room hallway on 3 separate occasions across 3 separate weeks, each time with a different woman trailing a few steps behind him, each time the door closing behind them for exactly the kind of stretch of time that left absolutely no room for innocent explanation. The footage didn't show explicit detail, the angle was too wide, and the image quality too poor for anything graphic. But the body language, the timing, the repeated pattern across multiple nights with multiple different women told me everything I needed to know without requiring a single further second of footage. I sat in that small back office for a long time after Trevor stopped the video, staring at a frozen frame of a hallway I had never once set foot in, feeling something enormous and unfamiliar settle over me. Not quite grief yet, something closer to clarity, cold and complete. Trevor apologized, told me he never would have shown me if he didn't think I deserved to know, said he'd actually confronted Derek himself once, quietly, a few weeks earlier, telling him he needed to stop using the recovery rooms like that, or he'd report it to management. Derek had apparently laughed it off, told Trevor it wasn't a big deal, told him to mind his own business, and even according to Trevor, slipped him $40 to keep things quiet a little longer. That detail landed harder than almost anything else. Derek hadn't just been careless or caught up in a moment of poor judgment. He had known exactly what he was doing, known it was wrong enough to require paying someone off, and had chosen, deliberately, to keep doing it anyway. I asked Trevor if he would be willing to show that footage to gym management, explaining the whole situation honestly. He said he'd already been meaning to report the unauthorized access issue regardless, and that having a clear reason attached to it, rather than just vague suspicion, would probably move things along faster. He told me he could set up a meeting with the general manager within a few days. I thanked him and drove home in a silence so complete I could hear my own pulse in my ears the entire way, already beginning, without fully realizing it yet, to build the plan that would end 4 years of my life in exactly the way I chose, rather than the way Derek had been quietly choosing without me. I didn't confront him that week. I spent it instead doing something far more useful than crying. I gathered everything I could. I asked Trevor to save copies of the relevant footage clips before management potentially deleted or restricted access to them. I quietly reached out to Priya's cousin at the front desk, who, once she understood what was actually happening, admitted she'd overheard Derek on the phone with someone he called Babe on more than one occasion while checking in at the counter, someone who clearly wasn't me, since he always hung up quickly whenever another employee walked past. I learned her name eventually. Madison Cole, 24 years old, one of the personal trainers who worked the evening shift. The same blonde woman I had watched him laughing with near the squat rack that first night in the parking lot. According to the front desk staff, Derek had been requesting her as his assigned trainer for private sessions almost exclusively since his second month at the gym. Sessions that conveniently always seemed to run long. Priya's cousin, whose name turned out to be Dana, told me Madison had actually mentioned Derek to a few coworkers with real affection, describing him as sweet and attentive in a way that made her think, for the first time in a while, that she might have finally found someone worth slowing down for. Dana said Madison had even started rearranging her own schedule to make sure she was working whenever Derek's usual evening slot came around. Small sacrifices made for a man she believed was entirely hers to build something with. I found out, through a little more careful asking, that Madison herself had no idea Derek had a girlfriend at all. He had apparently told her and several other women at the gym, based on what Trevor and the front desk staff pieced together, that he was single, recently out of a long relationship, looking for something casual while he figured out what he wanted next. That detail, more than the footage itself, was the one that finally cracked something open in my chest. He hadn't just been unfaithful. He had erased me entirely from his own story, rewritten 4 years of shared life into something that never happened, so that the women he pursued never had to feel like they were doing anything wrong. I met with the gym's general manager, a no-nonsense woman named Rosalind Perry, 3 days later, alongside Trevor, who walked her through the security footage and the unauthorized access pattern he'd documented over the past 2 months. Rosalind watched the footage with her jaw set tight, told us both that this represented a serious violation of gym policy on multiple fronts, unauthorized access to restricted areas being only part of the concern, given the liability issues around what members did inside those spaces without staff supervision. She told me directly that Derek's membership would be terminated immediately and permanently, and that she intended to have a firm conversation with any staff member involved as well, meaning Madison's job was very likely on the line too, given that facility policy explicitly prohibited trainers from engaging in personal relationships with clients during active training arrangements. I hadn't asked for that outcome specifically, but I didn't feel sorry about it either. I decided, sitting in Rosalind's office that afternoon, exactly how I wanted this to end. Not quietly. Not with some private, dignified conversation where Derek got to control the narrative and soften the landing for himself, the way he'd clearly been doing with every single woman he'd lied to. I wanted the truth to exist in the open, the same way his lies had existed in the open for months, while I sat at home proud of him for supposedly bettering himself. I went home that evening and packed exactly nothing. I waited instead. I invited Derek's mother, Linda, over for dinner that Friday, something we did occasionally, framing it as a normal family evening, and I made sure 2 of our closest mutual friends, a couple named Jess and Marcus, who we'd known since college, happened to already be there when Derek got home from work, having invited them over under the same casual pretense. Derek walked in around 6:30, still in his mechanic's uniform, greeted everyone with the easy, unbothered warmth he always carried, completely unaware that the floor was about to disappear beneath him. I waited until everyone had a drink in hand, until the small talk had settled into something comfortable, and then I set my phone on the coffee table, screen facing up, and pressed play on a short clip Trevor had helped me export. Nothing graphic, just security footage time-stamped and dated, showing Derek slipping through a prop door into a restricted hallway with a woman who was very clearly not me. The room went silent in a way I had never experienced before, the particular silence of several people processing something all at once. Linda's mouth fell open. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice already carried the weight of already knowing. I explained everything, calmly, the way I would explain a diagnosis to a worried pet owner, laying out facts in order without embellishment. The gym membership, he claimed, was for me. The late nights, the changed passcode, the security footage, the $40 he paid a guard to stay quiet, the trainer named Madison, who believed, entirely because Derek told her so, that he was single. Derek's face went through several stages of panic in front of everyone, first trying to deny it outright, then trying to minimize it, telling the room it wasn't what it looked like, that Trevor was exaggerating, that I was blowing a few careless flirtations completely out of proportion. Jess, who had been quiet up until that point, finally spoke, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Derek," she said, "that's a time-stamped security video from the gym you go to. That's not Scarlett exaggerating anything." Linda, to her credit, didn't defend her son. She sat there staring at her own hands for a long moment before looking up at me, her voice quiet and tired. "I'm sorry, Scarlett," she said. "I raised him better than this. I don't know what happened." Derek tried one more time, turning to me directly, his voice dropping into something pleading. "Scar, come on. We can talk about this alone. We don't need everyone here for this." "We had 4 years alone together," I said, "and you spent the last few months of it lying to my face every single night. I'm done doing this privately so you can keep controlling how it looks." Marcus stood up first, told Derek quietly that he needed some time to think about things, that this wasn't something he could just brush past. Jess left with him, giving me a tight, supportive hug on her way out the door. Linda stayed a few minutes longer, apologizing again before she left, telling me I deserved so much better than what her son had given me. Derek and I were alone in that apartment for the first time since he'd walked through the door, the silence between us entirely different from any silence we'd ever shared before. I told him to be gone by the end of the week. I told him I'd already looked into what it would take to break our lease early, and that I was willing to cover the difference myself if it meant not spending one more month living with someone I couldn't trust. He didn't argue. He didn't have much left to argue with. Within 2 weeks, word had traveled through the gym exactly the way I knew it would, once Rosalind terminated both his membership and, as it turned out, Madison's employment for the policy violation. Trevor told me later that the story became something of an open secret among the regulars. The guy who got kicked out for using the recovery rooms like a motel, and that Derek had apparently stopped showing his face anywhere near that side of town altogether. Madison reached out to me once, almost a month after everything came apart. A short, careful message telling me she was sorry, that she genuinely hadn't known, that she'd trusted him completely right up until the day Rosalind called her into the office. I believed her. There was nothing in the tone of that message that read like someone trying to justify herself, only someone who had clearly been just as thoroughly deceived as I had, in her own separate way. I told her I didn't blame her for any of it, and I meant it. Derek hadn't just betrayed one person's trust. He had built an entire structure out of other people's good faith, and every single one of us had simply been standing in a different room of the same lie. I moved out of our shared apartment within the month, found a smaller place closer to the animal hospital, a one-bedroom with good light and a small balcony where I started keeping a few plants I somehow managed not to kill. I signed up for my own gym membership eventually, a different facility entirely, not out of any need to prove something to Derek, but because I realized somewhere in the middle of that whole ordeal that I actually wanted the strength and the discipline for myself, separate from anyone else's approval or attention. Linda called me a few times over the following months, careful, apologetic calls where she never once tried to make excuses for her son, only asked how I was doing, told me she still considered me part of her life, regardless of what happened between me and Derek. I appreciated that more than I knew how to say. Some relationships end so completely that everyone attached to them disappears at once, and I was grateful, in the middle of losing so much, that I didn't have to lose her too. I think about that Tuesday evening sometimes, the one where Derek came home and told me so earnestly that he wanted to change for us. I used to believe that was the moment everything started going wrong. I don't believe that anymore. The moment things actually went wrong was quieter than that, buried somewhere in all the small choices he made afterward, every late night, every changed passcode, every woman he told a version of his life that conveniently left me out of it. I just happened to be the one paying close enough attention to eventually see all of it laid out in a single, undeniable frame. I am still a veterinary technician. I still spend my days reading pain in creatures who can't explain it themselves. And somewhere along the way, that same instinct finally taught me how to read it in people too. I don't regret the 4 years I spent with Derek. Not entirely, because they taught me something I needed to learn eventually anyway. That love without honesty isn't really love at all. Just a performance one person keeps giving while the other one keeps quietly rewriting the script behind their back. These days, when I lace up my shoes for my own workouts, I do it without a single thought of him. Some transformations are never really about becoming someone worth loving. They're about finally becoming someone who refuses to settle for less than the truth.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.